Good afternoon, everyone. We'll get started while more of our colleagues continue to filter in. NCTE welcomes all of our members today, as well as guests who may not yet be NCTE members. This event is open to everyone in support of Media Literacy Week. If you aren't yet an NCTE member, it's a great time to become one. Events like this are held nearly every week, if not more often. In fact, in just a few hours at 8 p.m. Eastern Time this evening, you can join us for our weekly member gathering. This week, our guest is author Rory Power, the New York Times bestselling author of Wilder Girls and Burn Our Bodies Down. A membership also entitles you to a deeply discounted convention registration price, which expires, the early bird version of this expires this Saturday, October 31st. NCTE is methodically increasing our attention on critical media literacy, building on a 2019 NCTE resolution. Because of this, we are an inaugural member of the National Media Alliance, formed by the National Association for Media Literacy Education. And I'm so pleased to recognize that the executive director of NAMLE is with us for this event today. We also have a task force well on its way to further exploring NCTE's next body of work in the realm of critical media literacy. Today's featured expert is leading this task force, in fact, Renee Hobbs. Renee's newest book, Mind Over Media, Propaganda Education for a Digital Age, has just been published. Today's discussion will feature some of the most pressing topics included in her book, all of which are particularly timely with the federal election just days away. Renee Hobbs is a world-renowned authority on digital and media literacy education. Through community and global service, and as a researcher, teacher, advocate, and media professional, Renee has worked to advance the quality of digital and media literacy education in the United States and around the world. She is the founder and director of the Media Education Lab, whose mission is to improve the quality of media literacy education through research and community service. She is the author of 10 books and over 150 scholarly articles on digital and media literacy. She is also a long-term and highly engaged NCTE member. Moderating today's discussion are two additional highly engaged NCTE members, Lauren Kelly and Nicole Mira. Lauren Kelly is an assistant professor in the Urban Social Justice Teacher Education Program at Rutgers University's Graduate School of Education. She is also the founder of the annual Hip Hop Youth Research and Activism Conference. Lauren taught high school English for 10 years in New York, where she also developed courses in hip hop literature and culture, spoken word poetry, and theater arts. She was also the recipient of a postdoctoral research fellowship at Boston University, studying the development of critical consciousness amongst high school students. Lauren's research focuses on adolescent critical literacy development, Black feminist theory, hip hop pedagogy, critical consciousness, and the development of critical, culturally sustaining pedagogies. Nicole Mira is an assistant professor of urban teacher education at the Graduate School of Education at Rutgers. She previously taught high school English language arts in Brooklyn, New York, and Los Angeles. Her research explores the intersections of critical literacy and civic engagement with youth and teachers across classroom, community, and digital learning environments. Central to her research and teaching agenda is a commitment to honoring and amplifying the literacy practices and linguistic resources that students from minoritized communities bring to civic life. In addition to her book, Educating for Empathy, Literacy, Learning, and Civic Engagement, she is the lead author of Doing Youth Participatory Action Research, Transforming Inquiry with Researchers, Educators, and Students. Lauren and Nicole, let's dig in.
Love that invitation. Thank you so much, Emily, for those introductions, and everyone for being here today. So I know we have only so much time, so we're going to jump right in with having this really powerful dialogue about the ideas in this text and the text itself. So thank you, Renee, for being here with us, for making the time for this discussion, and for this book that's a really powerful resource for learners and educators and literacy specialists and thinkers. So the first thing I want to ask you, since the subtitle of this book is Propaganda Education for a Digital Age, the term propaganda, we know, is quite provocative and is not used by educators as often as the term media. So how do you define propaganda, and how does propaganda education fit into the landscape of media literacy education today?
Yeah, that term propaganda, man, it just stops you, doesn't it? Because the minute you hear it, you think Nazi Germany, 20th century, Hitler, ugh, right? But actually, when you track the definition of propaganda over 100 years, it's really curious. It's a curious term. In the 1940s, the word propaganda meant the way that large numbers of people are induced to act together. And in the 1960s, Jacques Ellul said propaganda is a form of information that appeals to panders to our insecurities and our anxieties. And Neil Postman, a friend of NCTE, right, said, propaganda is a kind of communication that invites us to think in an either or manner. Intriguing, right? And in the 21st century, other scholars have said that propaganda is indifferent to truth. It's indifferent to truthfulness, and it uses any method to achieve its goal. But I actually, my learning journey about propaganda started with a consultation at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And that's why I'm sort of partial to their definition. They define propaganda as strategic and intentional communication that aims to influence the attitudes, opinions, and behaviors. They say it can be beneficial or harmful. It can use truth, lies, or half-truths. But what makes propaganda unique is the way it taps into people's deepest hopes, fears, and dreams. So propaganda, when you look at it that way, is deeply embedded in entertainment, in information, and persuasion. In fact, I would say everywhere you look, you are seeing examples of propaganda, and it's sort of easy to spot if you look for the distinctive features: activating strong emotions, simplifying information and ideas, appealing to people's deepest hopes, fears, and dreams, and attacking opponents. So media literacy education has been preoccupied with texts that connect the classroom and the culture, right? Texts that we encounter in the world outside the classroom that we need to read, that benefit from our heightened awareness. So propaganda education is media literacy education.
Yes, thank you so much for that. I think it's a really powerful thing to get us out of the realm of propaganda in the past to getting to propaganda all around us in the present right now, political and otherwise, right? Not just about the election, which is occupying many minds right now. But I do want to get into teachers, right? Let's get right into what teachers are experiencing, because I think there's a ton of energy right now around exploring media and exploring propaganda because of the divisive times we find ourselves in and this season. But at the same time that there's a lot of energy, teachers have a lot of concerns, a lot of valid concerns about wading into any type of media, but particularly propaganda and controversial issues in the classroom. So before we get to how we do it, which we're going to get to in just a moment, I think it's important to focus on the why. Why should we take this challenge on when it could be easier to maybe turn away and go back to canonical texts, away from the reality and get into something something that's a little easier. So why do you think it's so important that we grapple with media literacy and particularly with propaganda?
So if propaganda is the dominant rhetorical form in contemporary culture, then students need a lot of practice. It's like a practice muscle. They need a lot of practice in order to figure out how it works, rhetorically, how it works and how it works on them. Because propaganda is present in entertainment, in journalism, in information, in activism, and even in education, right? So learning to deploy a set of reading skills is a really important reason why propaganda education is so important. I think the fact that people think they're immune to propaganda, or they think it influences other people, or they only notice propaganda when it represents an idea they disagree with. They don't see the propaganda that reinforces and supports and buttresses and holds up their existing ideologies. They only notice the messages that don't fit into that paradigm. I think that the fact that that happens suggests that a form of education can make us aware of our blind spots, right? Our blind spots. And the most important reason, in my opinion, as you know, I've always defined media literacy in relation to not just being a media consumer, but being a media creator as well, right? And it turns out that if you're an activist and you see a problem in society and you want to play a part in changing it or addressing it, you have to be a propagandist. You have to use the power of communication to make a difference in the world. And to do that, guess what you're going to do? You're going to activate emotion, simplify information, appeal to people's deepest hopes, fears, and dreams, and sometimes you're going to attack opponents. So if we're trying to raise people to be citizens in a democracy, well, propaganda is actually one of the most important tools we use in the process of doing democracy. So that's why it's so important.
You know, you're speaking my language now with the civic engagement, but also just the teacher brain in me went off because everything you just explained in terms of production is also about the skills of reading, writing, listening, and speaking, Common Core, or whatever your state standards are. There's lots of resources that we can draw from as teachers that this work can and should be done in classrooms, right?
Yeah, I think one of the things I explore in the book is why isn't it then? If that's the case, Nicole, you know, why is propaganda not in many American high schools, not studied on the syllabus? And in fact, I talked to many teachers and report on many teacher stories in this book. And over the course of that research, discovered that propaganda kind of got pushed out right about the time that argumentative and argumentation started its rise, right? Because the idea was, well, argumentation, yeah, that's superior form, right? Use reason, evidence, claim, argument. And so when you focus on that, well, propaganda looks inferior, doesn't it? Right? It's about emotions. It's about simplicity. It's about connecting with people's lived experience. It's about speaking the language of your audience. Well, that doesn't work for text complexity, does it? So Common Core did a number on pushing propaganda out of the curriculum, and it's time for us to bring it back in and to understand the way in which the propaganda's abilities to activate strong emotions and to engage learners in multi-perspectival thinking, right? And to address complexity, address the value of complexity. Those are all benefits, like side effects that come from bringing propaganda education into the classroom.
Thank you so much for that. So along those lines, and to sort of further complicate and dig into this notion of what this looks like in the classroom, one thing I think about this notion that you said of teaching sort of about propaganda and the intersections of what it means to teach, what you're teaching can be seen as propaganda. And I think about sort of some of my experiences in the classroom, oftentimes when you're bringing in particular texts or conversations, parents, right, or other folks can see it as, oh, this teacher is teaching. So I wonder how we sort of wrestle with the complexity of teaching about this in a way that still is seen as democratic, is seen as impartial, right? Or the expectation of impartiality. And especially wrestling with this idea you gave in your definition of propaganda, this notion of multiple truths or pieces of truth or forms of truth. And so something we're wondering is how in classroom can teachers teach about, sort of wrestle or grapple with the multiple forms of truth, the different meanings of truth, and in particular, knowing how right now, and sort of always, right, historically, propaganda has been used to further marginalize, minoritize, sort of oppress vulnerable populations and communities, right? So how do we protect our students, protect some this, democratic ideals and processes and structures in the classroom and explore propaganda simultaneously? I know that.
No, those are all the questions that I tackle in the book. So I'm really happy that you're asking it, Lauren. Those are just the questions I'm fascinated about. One thing I think is really important to start with. So it turns out that once we start recognizing that propaganda can be beneficial or harmful, depending on your point of view, right? Then that opens up the door in a very easy way to thinking about the propaganda that we bring into the classroom already, like the textbook. Right? So beneficial propaganda, public service announcements, it's almost like the first media product that many American children ever create, right? They make a public service announcement in 7th grade about smoking or whatever. And it turns out that it's possible to address the topic of propaganda in a very non-controversial way. So I have provided to educators, hundreds of examples of really beneficial contemporary propaganda that gives kids a chance to exercise those critical thinking muscles, but isn't going to get parents all crazy, right? And so while that's a nice, comfortable place to start, it's also really important for educators to engage in some values clarification when it comes to why they might choose to bring in problematic propaganda. And in the book, I interview teachers who explain their different reasons, and different teachers have different reasons to do that, right? Because some people want to bring in problematic propaganda in order to activate that multi-perspectival thinking, right? Because you see that meme as just funny, but Nicole, when she looks at that meme, she goes, "Oh my gosh, that's not funny at all." Or yeah, it's funny, but it's awful, and here's why. And it turns out that when we get a small group of folks together looking at a piece of problematic propaganda, we experience the way meaning making is situational and contextual and collaborative and social. The social practice of literacy becomes so evident when we come together as a group to engage in meaning making and interpretation. But in some ways, I feel like the election of 2016 created we created a terrible opportunity. In 2016, there was so much fear, uncertainty, and doubt about the election. And of course, it was a very difficult time in our country's history that many teachers didn't teach about election propaganda because it was just too scary. It was just too difficult a time. And so in the book, we talk about how important it is for teachers to begin to get metacognitive about their own stance toward controversial issues in the classroom. Because once you start to reflect on, do I withhold my own views in the classroom? Am I aware that there are some issues that probably are problematic, but I have a blind spot. I don't see them as problematic. I brought this text in because I didn't think it would be a problem, but it turns out it was, right? Am I self-aware? Am I comfortable with students with expressing opinions that I find abhorrent, difficult, problematic? And how do I support or stifle dissenting views in my classroom? So all those different stances are an opportunity for educators. And what I found really interesting in my research inquiry is teachers described how starting to teach about propaganda puts you on a journey where, as you start getting more confident, you start being able to manage a classroom where kids have a lot of things to say, where they don't all agree. As you start to become more able to accept the multi-perspectival dynamic that emerges when propaganda comes into the classroom, then the authenticity and the empathy starts to grow too. So I end the book and I talk about how teachers who have brought propaganda education in the classroom say it deepens their sense of empathy toward their students. They feel like they have a better insight on where these kids are coming from, right? They also know that because the kid feels respected, right? Because we have a classroom where we can handle multiple points of view, right? So the kid feels respected. And so there's a culture of trust and respect. And that brings to empathic listening. One of the great activities in the game is that listening game, right? It's just so simple, but it's so powerful, right? You have to, it's a fishbowl activity where you're teaching kids how to listen, right? And it's so powerful. So I don't know if I answered that question or not, but
I created 15 more, but we'll get to that another day.
Yeah, this is these are the questions of education, right? And I love that. I love that idea of when you bring media and you bring propaganda into the classroom, you're letting the real world into the classroom. Therefore, you become a better teacher to help students deal with the real world, right? That we're not separating our schools or classrooms off from reality. I do have some questions about, we talk about multi-perspectival classrooms, but are there certain perspectives that we do not allow? Getting back to that idea of vulnerable populations or keeping kids safe means are there certain things that are off limits in the classroom, right?
Absolutely. Every teacher will make that decision for himself or herself. I'll share with you a story of how I wrestled with it myself. I've been working on this book forever, it seems like, right? In 2017, I started teaching my students about conspiracy theories. And that was the pre-QAnon days, when the conspiracy theories we were interested in were like faked moon landings. And now it seems so
very quaint.
So calm, so cool. But I faced a challenge when I realized that the time that I spent unpacking conspiracy theories meant that I did not have control over the interpretive process, right? And that some kids were going to get more curious about conspiracy theories because I validated them by bringing them into the classroom. And so I stepped away from that practice. Actually, I don't even write about conspiracy theories in this book, in the propaganda book, because I feel like it's a complicated, and now with QAnon, which is a truly dangerous conspiracy theory, right? That we're gonna have to practice and learn to figure out how we can do that in a socially responsible way. I haven't figured that out yet, but I do think that teachers who are self-aware, they trust their gut. That intuition down there, down in the pit of your stomach that says, I can use this, or I can use this YouTube video, or I can use this meme, or I can't use this, right? And so sometimes the best way to figure that out is to make mistakes. So in the book, I talk about how teachers have explained their learning from mistakes, right? They brought something in that did not go well, was not a productive conversation. And when teachers really take the time to reflect on what happened and why, that's part of the learning curve.
Yeah, and I think that's a great segue into the the gallery that you have. So I think the book is so powerful, and then it's even more powerful for teachers to also have this online gallery that you've put together. And I think the way you've structured it, there's a lot of parts in there that can help moderate that conversation to get to some of the more positive outcomes that you're talking about. So I'm wondering if you could maybe share your screen and share a little bit about like how the gallery is organized and how a teacher might use parts of it.
Yeah. And I'm not going to just show you the gallery. I'm going to show you the whole kit and caboodle of the, it's you put this in the chat room for people might want to go check it out. mindovermedia.us, right? So of course there's an excerpt from the book. That's so wonderful. Thanks to my friends at W.W. Norton. You can download an excerpt and decide, try before you buy, right? There's a lot of 2- and 3-minute videos on all kinds of topics, including conspiracy theories, peer-to-peer propaganda using the Facebook ad library, and textbook propaganda. But the 2 resources that I want to show you that I think are most useful are the Crowdsource Gallery. Here, when you click on the resources tab for middle school and high school teachers, I created a 9-lesson worksheet-driven inquiry on propaganda that starts with what's the definition and then how to spot it and analyze. And this is absolutely perfect if you're teaching middle school or high school. It's wonderful. And it links to this gallery. Why don't we watch the video and see how it works?
Today, propaganda is inescapable. In a world saturated with media messages, propaganda can be found in information, news, advertising, or entertainment. And sometimes it's easily recognizable. Other times, propaganda can be subtle. Are you more powerful than propaganda? The Media Education Lab introduces Mind Over Media, an online platform for understanding 21st century propaganda. At this website, you can view and discuss examples of propaganda in print, video, or digital forms. You can exchange opinions about the potential benefits and harms of media messages. Log into Mind Over Media by going to www.mindovermedia.tv. Take a look at the gallery and check out how people identify and evaluate propaganda that is a part of their everyday lives. Then find an example of the propaganda that you see, watch, and read. Upload a picture, a link to a video, or make a screenshot of a website that you think may be a form of propaganda. Explain your reasoning. Other viewers can comment on what you share.
But in order for it to work, you have to pay attention.
Are you more powerful than propaganda? Mind Over Media.
So what's really cool is anybody from anywhere in the world can upload an example of propaganda that they might find on their cell phone, their social media feed, a photograph that they might see in their neighborhood. When they do, it shows up in the gallery, and this is a searchable gallery, so you can type in country names, theater. That was cool. We were looking at propaganda in theater, right? And you get some really cool examples. There's 3,500 examples from 40 different countries, and they're really fascinating. Perhaps you guys saw this one. Did you see this one running recently? Let's see if I can play this one for you.
It sounds like a fairy tale. A man comes down from his tower and is crowned the most powerful man on earth. He gives to the rich and takes from the poor. He makes friends with our enemies and enemies of our friends. And then one day, a disease came upon the land. Fear not, he says, for it is a hoax and will not harm those who believe in me.
Okay, you guys get the concept, right?
I see what's going on there.
Yeah, that's a really cool one, right? But what makes it really powerful is that you can rate the propaganda. And once you rate it, you find out how other people have rated it. I found this really inspiring. I give it a beneficial. But look, not everyone who's been to the gallery thinks it's beneficial. And if I go look underneath, I see no harm to this propaganda, right? So it turns out that there's controversial propaganda and propaganda that activates multi-perspectival thinking. Oh, this one is from Romania. And it's absolutely amazing how, because propaganda simplifies information, that actually you can understand foreign propaganda because it uses emotions and symbols that kind of mean the language is actually not really necessary. There's some other resources there for you to take a look at, but I really want to introduce you to the online learning program. I'm so excited about this. Because of the COVID pivot, we've all gone to online learning, right? And I've been teaching propaganda online. So I decided to make my curriculum available, the curriculum that I use with my college students, available to anyone. You can see the 12 weeks of my semester right here. This week we're in conspiracy theories. Next week we're doing terrorism as propaganda. And after that, we'll do art and activism as propaganda, right? And each of these modules is a free library that you can take on your own, or you can take with your own cohort, right? So it's something I'm really proud of. I think it's really cool. It's got all the videos that I refer to in the book and some additional readings and some additional activities and some additional discussion questions. So I hope you explore the Mind Over Media website, because I really designed it for K-12 and college teachers to kind of be a on-ramp. It's so hard to keep up with this topic, and having resources at your fingertips can really help.
Thank you so much for sharing this. I know we all need to make sure we save this link and explore this for hours and days after this conversation. So I think, what you've shared with us here is a really powerful resource for teachers who have sort of committed to engaging in this work. And I'm wondering if you have any guidance for those. You mentioned before that teachers sometimes are fearful, right? Are nervous about engaging in this type of in bringing this content or these perspectives into the classroom. So is there guidance for getting teachers from that fear stage into what you refer to as sort of the teacher journey, right? So how do we get them to even begin the journey and be okay with making those mistakes and messing up, and considering, again, that there could be pushback, right? And that could be parents we mentioned, but even administrators, right? Saying this isn't sanctioned, or this isn't okay, or it's getting into controversial territory. So how do we sort of support and guide teachers in navigating that?
That's a great question. English teachers have been teaching Animal Farm by George Orwell for 70 years now. 70 years. In fact, it's a book that kind of came into the canon immediately as soon as it was created. It was written in 1949, and in 1950, teachers in British and American schools were teaching it, and they continue to teach it, right? So I feel it's really important for teachers to sort of begin with their comfort zone, right? And to begin with the things that they value and love. And so teachers who are fond of memes can find it easy to bring memes and meme making into the classroom. A teacher who has a favorite podcast can find it easy to bring that podcast into the classroom. And you know what? It's probable that much of the media that you really love yourself, if you're a young teacher, or if you're a middle-aged teacher, or if you're an old teacher like me, it's probably the case that most of the media that you really love can be conceptualized as propaganda in the eyes of someone, which is why I always say propaganda is in the eye of the beholder. We should not go into the classrooms going, this is propaganda, this is not propaganda, nope. You know what? My favorite media could be something you perceive as propaganda. And so if we start with the media that we love, if we start with the media that we think our students appreciate, then we can start to discover how, if we get outside of our own head, we can recognize, oh, this might be controversial to somebody, right? So, and in a way, sometimes our students help us do that with our own stuff, right? That's why we love teaching.
That is why we love teaching. I was thinking about the research that's been coming out recently about, misinformation, quote unquote fake news. The idea that sometimes there's a perception sometimes that media literacy will solve this, right? Like if we just teach folks about the fact that propaganda exists, or if we teach them about the qualities and the different tactics that it uses, that we will magically become a harmonious society again, in which we don't have these political divisions. But we do know that at the same time that folks can be exposed to truths and continue to dig into their perspectives because it reflects their deeply held beliefs, their identities, and that just teaching folks what is fact or fiction or how they're being manipulated doesn't always mean that they're like magically going to change their views. So in the end, what is the purpose of this education? Is the purpose to get folks on the same page? Is it just to have critical thinking for whatever they choose to believe? What do you see as the ultimate purpose of this kind of education?
That's a really great question. So I think there are a set of misconceptions in our culture right now that are causing a lot of problems that we need to clear away, right? And in the book, I talk about how fact checking, not really very effective. Define a fact versus an opinion. Oh, English teachers love that. Doesn't work. It's not very good. We don't do it very well. And we have all kinds of baggage on the question of what is a fact and what is opinion that really get in the way of us understanding those concepts. But I think there are 4 misconceptions that we can clear up through propaganda education. The first one is that this misguided belief that truth requires certainty, right? That to come to the truth, we have to have an absolute 100% completely locked down belief in it, right? And in every case, our understanding of truth changes as we gain more knowledge and information. Our understanding of truth is always provisional, based on our best thinking at the time, right? And we can see that a lot of the conflicts in our society right now are rooted in a misunderstanding of this provisional nature of truth. The computer scientists and business executives, they have translated this misconception into a lovely phrase. David Weinberger used it in his wonderful book. He said, the thinking strategy that we need is strong opinions weakly held. I have strong opinions about a whole bunch of political topics, but I'm willing to revise my understanding based on evidence and information, based on new points of view. I understand that certainty is not required for me to have some beliefs that I can hold on to and use in my decision making. The second misconception that people have is that if your emotions are activated, then you should beware. Kathleen Hall Jamieson in her book, her media literacy book, said, if it's scary, be wary, right? The idea was people who try to activate your emotions are a bunch of creeps and losers, right? Who just want to manipulate you. And it's like, well, no, actually, that's a misconception, because feelings are a really valuable source of information. And I think with my head, my heart, and my spirit, right? As a whole human being. So we don't have to think of emotions and emotional response as the enemy. In fact, in English education, we embrace that, right? We recognize that emotional response is a way of knowing. Third misconception, conflicts about truth are dangerous. People think that if we have a difference of opinion about what's true, that somehow that's bad or dangerous or awful. But you know what? It's actually the case that the only way we come close to truth is by encountering those conflicts. And that's been part of the problem that we've had in the last 20 years, right? Since the rise of social media, we have less exposure to those truths that are outside our comfort zone. We don't interact with people who have different truths than we do. And so the polarization has intensified. But it turns out that it's only when you hold on to your own truth as intractable that the conflict becomes dangerous. If I come into an encounter willing to listen and to ask questions, then conflicts about truth create opportunities for more learning. Yay! Finally, the fourth misconception, and I think this is, we've all been around the block on this one, this idea that there is only one right truth, right? And I feel like the big aha of my experience as an adult is that there are many ways of understanding a problem, and that I learn more when I come at a topic with humility, aware of the limitations and biases in my own thinking. And the more conscious I am, the more self-aware and humble I am, well, the better teacher I am. As you guys all know, you've had those moments of experience where when you say to your students, I don't know, I'm not sure, I'm confused about that, I don't know what to think. Kids just, so once we step away from teacherly authority to say, I don't know, I'm not sure, I don't know what to think about this, I'm confused too, then we become co-learners and we all have to wrestle it together. And then I need people with different points of view, right? Romanian educator Nicoleta Fotiada told me how growing up in the Soviet-controlled Romania, she well understood that she could learn from false propaganda. She could learn from biased points of view. And it really does reflect this idea that when we encounter ideas that make us uncomfortable, there's an opportunity there for us to reinforce our own beliefs or to move them in a different direction, and to be curious, to be intellectually curious. So those are the misconceptions, I think, that lie at the heart of the kind of epistemological crisis that we're in the middle of right now.
Thank you so much for that, for all of those, the misconceptions and the notions. And I think, Renee, this question that came from, forgive me if I'm saying your name wrong, Clarice Moran in the chat, I think is in some ways a challenge or an invitation regarding those misconceptions. And it's about teacher education, right? So oftentimes pre-service English educators can enter, teaching programs with sort of the exact misconceptions you said, right? The notion that there is one truth, that the text has one theme, that there's one idea, right? Having been sort of trained in more canonical and traditional structures of literacy and literature and learning. And so a challenge for teacher educators is conveying exactly what you just said, right? With teachers that feel like, okay, I don't necessarily know how to teach, or pre-service teachers who are learning how to teach, but the thing that they feel they know is English, right? And literature and writing, that's sort of the thing that they're a master of. And now they're learning, how do you teach that to young people? And so I think that invitation to disrupt all of those understandings about what you know, and the sort of sturdiness of what you know is a challenge. So what, I guess, suggestions or guidance do you have for pre-service teacher educators on how to sort of cultivate that, right? That curiosity and bring them there?
So at the Summer Institute in Digital Literacy, we like to say, there's no growth in the comfort zone, and there's no comfort in the growth zone. So, and I have a lot of sympathy for wanting to feel comfortable. Like, you think about it, yes, how do you manage to start a new career where you're almost as young as your students? And how do you manage to create a learning environment? It does involve the deployment of teacherly authority, right? So, but in some ways, that's something you can learn in a year, right? And so then what are you going to learn the second year? What are you going to learn the third year? So I don't think it's a situation that a brand new beginning teacher needs to eat the whole elephant all in one bite, right? But this idea that you make a commitment to be a lifelong learner, that you keep challenging yourself, that you stop getting fixed in doing the same old, we do every year in October, we do To Kill a Mockingbird, and then we do blah, 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 to learn to be suspicious of the comfort zone and put yourself in the growth zone. Yeah, that's the mindset that even young teachers can get excited about. even though they might not master all these competencies all in the first 1 or 2 years.
We have another question in the chat from Joyce, and she's talking about retooling all of us educators to get out of these binary approaches. So I'm thinking of what you said about, fact versus opinion, some of the activities we all did in school that we might have also been doing in our own classrooms. And I'm thinking, obviously, there's tons of strategies in the book, and you talk about ways that students can actually create propaganda. So I'm wondering if you could share a few of the creative things you've seen teachers doing to get past those old ways of teaching fact and opinion and getting beyond the binary into doing some more creative things with propaganda.
Yeah, let me tell you about the Emilys in Texas, right? I met the Emilys, two high school teachers in Texas, and they really opened up my eyes. They were experienced media literacy teachers, and they offered a lot of insight that made me think in new ways about my practice. For many, many years, if you're an English teacher or a teacher librarian, and maybe in teachers in other areas as well, you might have used one of those gotcha websites, like the Pacific Tree Octopus website. It sort of looks like a real website, but it's not, or the male pregnancy website, or the dihydrogen monoxide, it's a poisonous chemical website, but it's really water. So teachers like to use those gotcha websites because it creates an emotional jolt for students, right? Because all of a sudden they realize, this is fake. But the Emilys helped me understand that pedagogy is kind of rooted in a trick. It puts the teacher in a position of intentionally pranking kids. And there's an ethics to pranking that's rooted in power, right? And in power inversions. And so they helped me to see that gotcha websites, you got a short-term thrill, but you didn't actually do anything to develop the relationship. And in fact, you kind of impaired the relationship because you are pointing fingers and telling kids, you can't analyze, you misunderstood it, you got it wrong, right? It reinforces just all the wrong messages. So that was huge for me. And then the other thing the Emilys taught me was forget about debates. Never, ever use debates. And they also said, don't ever make news consumption into an assignment. They said, basically, just forget about forcing kids to write summaries of news stories. So that will make them hate reading the news. That will make them hate journalism. You've just turned something that's really fun and interesting and important into homework, right? So they suggested that in their high school classroom, they do not use debate structures to set up pro cons about current events, because what happens is kids want to win. And the competitive instinct to want to win the debate interferes with actually the development of genuine understanding. And so the Emilys said to me, look, in my classroom, the point is understanding. And what we're doing is we're having a conversation together to get toward a shared understanding. And if we set up a debate where we've created a competition and a winner, and that does not promote genuine understanding. So those are some really interesting ways of thinking about our pedagogy in new ways that make us reflect on what's the values message underneath the pedagogy. And I haven't even talked about creating propaganda, but creating propaganda is really empowering for kids. I send my students to the dosomething.org website. It has a list of causes. I say, pick any cause that's on this list, which makes it possible that I never get a piece of propaganda about, the South shall rise again or anything like that, right? I get a range of good topics that I can live with, and the kids get to create contemporary propaganda. Maybe they make an infographic, a podcast, maybe they make a music video, a meme. Sometimes they just write a press release, right? But it helps them realize that they can use the same powerful rhetorical strategies that they see all around them, they can use that to make a difference in the world. And that's overall the big message I want my students to come out with.
That's really powerful. Thank you for that. And I think that helps to answer a lot of the questions around the why, right? Why do we do this? Ultimately, if the critical thinking is developed, right? That sort of activist citizenry, developing agency, right? Then the why for you as an educator becomes what leads to that goal. And I think this question that Greg Davis asked in the chat brings us back to earlier you'd said that there's sort of a gut feeling you have as a teacher, right? Where you just sort of know this doesn't work for the classroom, or this could be harmful. And sometimes when we don't have the gut feeling, we mess up and then we sort of reflect on that. So Greg asked, when thinking about a piece of propaganda as either beneficial or harmful, right? Which again goes back to that binary. How might that be impacted by one's own personal view, right? So you mentioned sort of bringing what you love into the classroom, bringing podcasts you listen to, but how might a teacher's own sort of understanding or perspectives about the harm or the benefit impact how they're teaching it, right? What they're introducing and what students walk away with?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question. Just hearing that propaganda might be beneficial is kind of mind-blowing to a lot of people, right? What does that mean? How could propaganda be beneficial? And so I like to use the metaphor of the onion, right? With the layers, the concentric peel, the whatever that is of an onion, the layers of an onion. At the easiest level, I can ask myself, is this propaganda beneficial to me? Right? So that Disney propaganda, wear a mask, da, 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 da. You know, that is beneficial to me because it reminds me of my love of Disney. And it ties my love of Disney to something I believe in, which is that mask wearing should not be a big deal. So at the simplest and most intimate level, that's easy to figure out. But if I'm really going to analyze a message being beneficial or harmful, I have to scale up a little bit. I have to ask, well, is this beneficial or harmful to my people in my neighborhood, right? To my family members, to my community, to my country, to my world? And at each of those levels of analysis, it gets more complicated, right? And the question of benefits and harms gets more nuanced and more contextual, right? And so it's that idea of the way in which reflecting on propaganda allows us to have a more nuanced conversation about how, like, propaganda is it's always beneficial to the person who created it. You know, Leni Riefenstahl thought she was doing a great thing by making Triumph of the Will, right? The film, the fake documentary that glorified Hitler, she thought she was doing a good thing, right? But when we understand it in a more contextual way, we see the real harms that came from turning Hitler into a savior, right? And the messages of Hitler as a savior, we now see were terribly destructive to the German people, right? So it's a decentering process of multi-perspectival thinking that kind of helps us think about propaganda in relation, not just to ourselves, but into our community and our world.
And then I know we have to wrap up in just a second. I'm going to try to squeeze in Donna Nelson Schneider's final question. I think it's interesting. She's kind of leading us toward, if we talk about propaganda, how can that also lead us into talking about journalism and news reporting? Because I think it's an interesting pathway in. We're seeing the product and we're analyzing the product of propaganda, but then it's a gateway into maybe talking about like the media industrial complex writ large and like what PACs or what organizations produce this propaganda and for what purposes. So have you seen it as a way into talking about just how information gets produced in our society right now?
Yeah, let's talk about that. That's chapter 4. It turns out that the very first contemporary theories of propaganda in the 1980s was rooted in the work of Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman, who described and identified that news was and is a form of propaganda. And they identified the 5 filters that help us see how news is designed to reinforce the status quo, right? So it turns out that reporter-source relationships keep in place status quo ideologies because reporters are so dependent on the government and business industry sources that they relate to. So yes, absolutely. So to study propaganda, you must study news, journalism, and public relations.
Well, I see Emily's popped up, which means that even though we have many more things to talk about, this is just the beginning of a conversation. And we know that you're part of the NCTE committee that's going to be working on this. And so I'm sure we'll find more opportunities to keep talking about this. So thank you so much.
Thanks
For inviting me.
Thank you, Nicole and Lauren, for engaging Renee in such a energetic and passionate and informative dialogue. Every conversation with Renee tends to go in this direction, and our field is so much stronger for having Renee's presence in it, as well as for your presence, Lauren and Nicole. We thank you. NCTE also extends appreciation to our partners for Media Literacy Week, most specifically the National Association for Media Literacy Education. We're so proud to be aligned with you and look forward to deepening our work as the months and years go on. Again, if you don't already have your copy of Renee's new book, please consider purchasing it. You will not be disappointed. Speaking of not being disappointed, the slide before us reminds us of the incredible lineup we have scheduled for NCTE's virtual convention set for November 17th through 22nd, or 19th through 22nd, excuse me. Not only can you hear Trevor Noah, but also two U.S. Poet Laureates, Andrea Davis Pinckney, Patrice Kahn-Cullors, Jeff Chang, and Kali Fajardo Einstein. It's an incredible lineup along with your peers in our discipline. It's truly a not to miss event. And again, early registration pricing is available through Saturday, October 31st. So just a few days left on that. Again, thank you for today's discussion. And we'd like to remind you that at 8 p.m. tonight, we have our weekly member gathering with author Rory Power. Thanks so much, everyone, and see you soon.